Welcome to Vicar's Secret Locked Away, a Miss Marple mystery, where a stolen letter and a buried secret shatter a quiet village's peace. Only Miss Marple can see the truth, hidden behind the smiles. Where are you listening from? Let us know in the comments. It was one of those mild spring afternoons when the air hung with the fragrance of primroses and distant wood smoke. The village of Mead lay content under a lazy sun, its thatched roofs gleaming like old gold. The vicarage garden looked particularly charming that day, daffodils nodding along the gravel path, and a faint hum of bees drifting through the lilac hedge. Miss Marple, neat as ever in her dove-grey cardigan, sat in the vicarage drawing-room with her knitting in her lap. She had been invited to tea by Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, a kind, fluttery woman who could never quite sit still when she talked. The vicar himself, Reverend Leonard Clement, was by the fireplace, pretending to read his notes for Sunday's sermon, though his expression was far too thoughtful for scripture alone. "Such a pleasant day, isn't it, Miss Marple?" said Mrs. Clement, pouring another cup. "I do believe spring has truly arrived." "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly, her needles clicking, "though spring has a way of revealing what winter has hidden. Gardens and people alike, I find." Mrs. Clement laughed lightly, missing the undercurrent in that remark. "Oh, you're always so observant. But truly, one does need a little brightness after all that dreadful rain." From the hallway came the sound of the front door closing, followed by hurried steps. A moment later, the vicar's young maid, Edie, appeared. Cheeks flushed. "Excuse me, sir, but there's a man asking to see you. Says it's urgent." The vicar rose at once. "Who is it, Edie?" "Mr. Pierce from the post office, sir. He says it's about the safe, something gone wrong with the lock." Mrs. Clement looked, puzzled. "The safe? Whatever for? There's hardly anything in it." The vicar's brow furrowed. "I'll go and see. Excuse me, ladies." He left the room, footsteps firm along the corridor. Miss Marple, though she did not move, quietly registered the faint tremor in Mrs. Clement's voice as she murmured, "How very odd." The old lady's blue eyes lingered on the teacups, noting the untouched scone on the vicar's plate, the nervous folding of Mrs. Clement's napkin, and the faint sound of raised voices from the study beyond. Moments later, the door reopened. Reverend Clement re-entered, his expression grave. "It seems," he said slowly, "that the safe in my study has been tampered with. The lock is broken clean open." Mrs. Clement gasped. "Good heavens! But what on earth for?" "That," said the vicar, "is what puzzles me. The only thing inside, aside from parish documents, was the sealed envelope Mr. Halliday left with me last week." "Miss," Marple looked up from her knitting. "Mr. Halliday. That would be the solicitor from Much Benham, I believe." "Yes." The vicar nodded. "He visited regarding the late Colonel Graves's estate. He left a confidential letter in my care, to be opened only upon his instruction or in the event of his death." A silence followed. Mrs. Clement looked alarmed. "Surely that's not Leonard. Do you think—" "I don't know, my dear," he interrupted gently. "But the envelope is gone." Miss Marple set down her knitting. "How very curious," she murmured. "Locks, I always think, are rather like people. They tell one a good deal about character when broken. Some with force, some with cunning." The vicar smiled faintly, though his worry did not ease. "It's probably some local mischief, Miss Marple. Still, I must report it, and I fear Mr. Halliday will be most upset." The next morning brought worse news. Mr. Halliday, the solicitor, was found dead in his office in Much Benham, apparently of heart failure, though the circumstances were strange. His assistant reported hearing voices late the previous night, followed by the sound of the safe door closing. No signs of violence, no missing money, just one empty space where a single sealed letter had been kept. When the vicar received the news at breakfast, he went pale. "Then that means he never came to collect it himself." "Miss Marple," sipping her tea calmly, said, "Quite so," which suggests that someone knew of that letter's importance and took steps to retrieve it first. "But who could possibly have known?" cried Mrs. Clement. The old lady's eyes twinkled faintly over the rim of her cup. "In villages, dear Mrs. Clement, secrets are rarely secret for long. There is always someone who overhears a remark at the grocer's or notices who visits after dusk. That afternoon, Inspector Slack arrived from the county police, brusque and efficient. "If it's village gossip we're after, Miss Marple," he said with a faint smirk, "I suppose we'll start with your recommendations." Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Oh, I shouldn't think you'll need me, Inspector. I dare say the truth will come to you in time. It usually does, after a few wrong turns." As he left to question the postmaster, Miss Marple turned her attention to the vicar. "Tell me, Mr. Clement," she said gently, "who else knew you had that letter in your safe?" The vicar frowned. "No one but my wife, and possibly Edie, though she wouldn't have understood its importance." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And yet, the lock was forced cleanly by someone who knew where to look. I wonder if your safe was the only thing in this village being carefully guarded, Reverend Clement, or if perhaps there are other secrets long locked away." Outside, the church bell tolled 4, the sound carrying softly across the fields. A gust of wind lifted the edge of Miss Marple's shawl as she stood by the vicarage window, her gaze resting on the quiet lane beyond. Somewhere, unseen, the first thread of a web had been tugged, and Miss Marple, though no one noticed, began already to follow it. The following morning dawned bright and clear, yet there was a faint unease hanging over Mary Mead like a mist that refused to lift. At the grocer's, 2 women lingered over the biscuit counter far longer than necessary, speaking in voices meant to sound hushed, but carrying easily through the open door. Word of the vicarage burglary and of poor Mr. Halliday's sudden death had spread with astonishing speed. By noon, every shopkeeper, gardener, and maid had heard some version of the tale, each more elaborate than the last. At the post office, Mr. Pierce was attempting to maintain an air of calm professionalism while fielding the villagers' pointed questions. "A simple matter of burglary, that's all," he said for perhaps 10th time, his voice clipped. No reason to drag innocent names through the mud. Yet his hands fidgeted with the mail ledger, and his eyes darted toward the back room as though something unseen troubled him. Miss Marple, standing at the counter with her weekly letters, noted these small signs without comment. Her gaze moved thoughtfully to the rack of telegram forms beside him, where a single, unused one had been torn halfway through and hastily put back. "So many disturbances in so few days," she murmured gently. "It must be quite a strain, Mr. Pierce, keeping everything running smoothly." He gave a nervous laugh. "Yes, well, one does one's best. But between that safe business and the inquest they're talking about for Mr. Halliday, it's no small thing." He seemed to regret the words instantly, closing the ledger with a sharp snap. Miss Marple smiled mildly, thanked him, and made her way back toward the high street. She passed Mrs. Price Ridley's gate, where the lady herself stood in full gossiping glory, hat slightly askew, eyes alight with self-importance. "My dear Miss Marple," she cried, waving her parasol, "I hear you were there when it all began. Such a dreadful shock to think our own vicarage might be involved in something so well sinister." "It is unsettling," Miss Marple replied calmly. "Though, of course, burglary is not always as wicked as it seems. Sometimes it's merely a matter of poor judgment." Mrs. Price Ridley gave a satisfied little sniff. "Judgment indeed. I told Colonel Easterbrook only last week that letting those village boys hang about the lane at night would come to no good. Mark my words, someone saw an open window and couldn't resist temptation." Miss Marple nodded, as if considering it. "Perhaps," she said softly, "though one wonders why a petty thief would trouble himself with the vicar's old safe when there are easier things to take." That evening, Miss Marple dined quietly at home, her mind sifting through the day's observations. She had seen Mrs. Clement walking briskly toward the church, her face pale, clutching what looked like a folded note. Later, the vicar himself had gone to the Halliday offices in Much Benham and returned looking older than before. And then there was Edie. The maid, nervous, evasive, claiming to have heard nothing on the night of the break-in, though Miss Marple recalled distinctly that Edie's room faced the very window where the intruder must have entered. When Inspector Slack called later that night, Miss Marple was expecting him. He seemed unusually irritable. "Nothing stolen worth mentioning," he grumbled. "Only that blasted letter gone missing. But I've spoken to Halliday's clerk, says his employer was worried someone was after a document about the Graves estate. Confidential business, tied up with old debts." "Debts?" Miss Marple repeated gently. "Exactly. Apparently the Bruve Colonel left a few obligations unpaid. Nothing criminal, just messy. Halliday was sorting it. But someone must have thought that letter contained proof of something valuable or dangerous," Miss Marple said quietly. Slack looked at her sharply. "Dangerous? Oh, come now, Miss Marple. You don't think this is murder?" She smiled faintly. "Not necessarily. But death and opportunity often keep close company, Inspector. And when one appears, the other is never far behind." He frowned, unconvinced, and took his leave. Miss Marple stood by her window long after he had gone, watching the faint lamplight flicker across the lane. Somewhere beyond the hedgerow, a shape moved quickly, quietly, and then was gone. Perhaps just a cat, she thought, or perhaps someone ensuring that what had been taken remained hidden. The next morning, Mrs. Clement came calling, pale and flustered. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful," she whispered. "Leonard's been summoned again to Much Benham. They say the letter might concern a trust fund, something scandalous from years ago. And Edie, she's packed her things and left without a word." Miss Marple looked up, her expression serene though her mind was already racing. "Left, you say? Without collecting her wages?" "Just gone." "How very curious," Miss Marple said, her voice low. "People who flee so suddenly often do so not from guilt, but from fear. The question is, fear of what, or of whom?" Outside, the church bell tolled again, echoing faintly across the green. And in the stillness that followed, Miss Marple knew the pattern of human folly was beginning to take shape. The afternoon light slanted across Miss Marple's sitting room, casting soft gold on the lace curtains and the tidy row of books beside her chair. A kettle hummed faintly on the hob as she sat reflecting, the rhythmic motion of her knitting only partly concealing the quick, darting activity of her mind. Edie's sudden disappearance troubled her, not in the sense of guilt, but in its timing. The girl had fled within hours of the police taking renewed interest in that missing letter. That, Miss Marple reasoned, was no coincidence. Outside, the lane was quiet, save for the clatter of a milk cart and the occasional bark of a distant dog. Yet Mary Mead's stillness, she knew, was deceptive. Beneath the calm surface, emotions were shifting: fear, curiosity, the delicious thrill of scandal. She had seen it too many times before. When Reverend Clement returned from Much Benham, the first person he saw waiting by the vicarage gate was Miss Marple herself. She greeted him with her customary gentle smile. "I hope you'll forgive my intrusion, Reverend, but I thought perhaps a walk together might help clear both our heads." He sighed, weary but grateful. "You've heard, I suppose. They've confirmed the envelope contained a confession, a signed statement by Colonel Graves admitting to falsifying a financial record many years ago. Halliday was safeguarding it until a beneficiary could be notified." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And this beneficiary? Would they have had reason to prefer the confession remain unseen?" "That's precisely what I've been wondering. The Colonel's nephew, young Mr. Martin Graves, inherits the estate, though his reputation is less than steady." But there's also Miss Helen Halliday, his fiancée, and she's the one who insisted on the letter's confidentiality. Love and money rarely make a peaceful match, Miss Marple murmured. As they reached the churchyard, a small figure darted out from behind the lich gate. It was Tommy Pierce, the postmaster's son, clutching a folded note. He froze when he saw them, eyes wide. "Oh, beg pardon. Sir didn't see you there." The vicar frowned. "What's that you've got, Tommy?" "Just a message, sir, for Mrs. Price Ridley. From the bus station, I think." He looked flustered, stammered, and then ran off before either could ask more. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the boy's retreating figure. "How odd," she said softly. "Messages rarely come from the bus station unless someone is leaving or about to arrive." That evening, she found herself invited once again to tea at the vicarage. Mrs. Clement was subdued, her usual chatter replaced by anxious glances toward her husband. "Leonard," she said in a trembling voice, "it's awful. They've found Edie's suitcase just abandoned near the footpath to Much Benham, and in it a torn piece of paper with part of a name written on it. Gur. Something. The rest is missing." Miss Marple's fingers paused on her teacup. "Graves, perhaps?" The vicar nodded gravely. "Most likely. But why would Edie have written his name?" "Not written," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Perhaps copied from something she saw. You mentioned the letter bore Colonel Graves's signature. Could it be she glimpsed it before it disappeared?" A heavy silence fell. Then, "Mrs." Clement whispered, "But if that's true," and she realized its importance, then someone might have followed her. Miss Marple looked toward the window where dusk was gathering. Indeed, and if so, the letter's disappearance and Edie's flight may be two ends of the same thread. That night, long after the lamps were out, a soft knock sounded at Miss Marple's door. When she opened it, she found the vicar's gardener, old Henry Wills, hat in hand. "Beg pardon, ma'am," he said, voice low. "Didn't like to disturb the vicar, but I thought you ought to know. I was up near the footpath this evening, and I found something odd near where they say the girl's case was left." He held out a small metal object, a broken key, its edge jagged. Miss Marple took it delicately, her eyes narrowing. "How very interesting," she murmured. "You have a good eye, Mr. Wills. I fancy this may open a door we didn't know was locked." When he left, she turned the key over in her palm. A safe key, perhaps, but not the vicar's. That one had been found untouched after the burglary. So whose? Then. The firelight flickered against her spectacles as she set the key beside her knitting. "Human nature," she whispered to herself, "is like that key, ordinary on the surface, but full of rough edges that don't fit where they should. It only takes one wrong turn for everything to come undone." Outside, the night deepened, the village silent, save for the distant toll of the church bell, slow, deliberate, like the heartbeat of a secret waiting to be uncovered. Morning mist clung to the roofs of Mary Mead like a veil, softening the edges of the familiar cottages. By the time the clock at the church struck 9, Miss Marple was already walking briskly toward the high street, her shawl drawn close against the chill. In her pocket, the small broken key lay wrapped in a handkerchief. She had examined it by lamplight the night before and could not shake the feeling that it belonged to something important, something beyond the vicar's modest safe. Her first stop was the blacksmith's forge at the edge of the village. Mr. Pritchard, a stout man with hands like carved oak, looked up in surprise as she entered. "Morning, Miss Marple. Haven't seen you in here since that business with the vicar's bicycle chain." She smiled pleasantly. "Yes, and you fixed that beautifully, Mr. Pritchard. I wonder, might you look at this for me? It's a broken key, and I'm curious what kind of lock it might once have opened." He turned it over, whistled softly. "Fine workmanship. Not from an ordinary door, I'd say. This looks like part of a Chubb safe key, same sort used in offices or banks. The sort that keeps papers locked away from prying eyes." Offices or banks, she repeated quietly. How very interesting. As she left the forge, she paused near the lane leading toward the post office. Through the window, she could see Mr. Dine. Pierce, speaking with a stranger, a man in a dark overcoat, his face pale and strained. They spoke briefly, and the man left, glancing about nervously before hurrying toward the bus stop. Miss Marple, unseen behind the hedge, watched him go. A stranger in Mary Mead was always a subject of curiosity, but in days like these, curiosity bordered on suspicion. She returned home to find Inspector Slack waiting at her gate. "Ah, there you are, Miss Marple. I was just about to knock." His tone was curt, but there was a flicker of respect in his eyes. "We've had another development. Halliday's clerk came forward this morning, apparently. Mr. Halliday received a visit 2 nights before his death from someone asking about that letter. Wouldn't give a name, just said he'd come on behalf of the vicar." Miss Marple frowned. The vicar would never send anyone in such a manner. "Exactly," said Slack. "But whoever it was, he convinced Halliday to show him the safe. The clerk left them alone, and by morning, the letter was gone." She considered this quietly. Then whoever broke into the vicar's safe already knew what to look for. It was not an act of impulse. It was completion. Slack looked at her sharply. "Completion of what?" "Of a circle," Miss Marple said softly. "The first act was deception, the second concealment. The final will be silence, unless we are quick enough." Before Slack could ask what she meant, Mrs. Clement appeared at the gate, breathless and pale. "Inspector! Miss Marple! Something dreadful, Mr. Pierce is dead!" They followed her to the post office, where a small crowd had already gathered. Mr. Pierce sat slumped over his desk, a cup of tea overturned beside him. The faint scent of bitter almonds hung in the air. Slack's expression hardened. Poison. Quick and quiet, he never stood a chance. Miss Marple's eyes moved over the scene. The half-folded telegram on the counter, the empty drawer behind him, the faint smear of ink on his sleeve. She bent slightly, peering at a scrap of paper that had fluttered to the floor. It bore only a few words. "Meet me, Mill Lane, dusk." Later, as the inspector barked orders and sent for the coroner, Miss Marple slipped quietly away. The pattern was clearer now. Edie had fled, the letter had vanished, and now Mr. Pierce, who handled messages for the entire village, was dead. Communication, secrecy, and silence all intertwined. By the time she reached her garden gate, the evening sun was dipping low. She paused, her gaze settling on the old church spire, gleaming faintly through the trees. Somewhere beneath its shadow lay the truth. She could feel it. Someone had moved unseen among them, using the village's quiet rhythms as a disguise. As she entered her cottage, she found a small envelope pushed under her door. Her name, written in hurried scrawl, caught the fading light. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single torn fragment of paper, familiar handwriting, careful and deliberate. It read, "Forgive me, Miss Marple. I did not mean for it to go so far." She held it for a long time, the corners trembling slightly between her fingers. The confession of fear, perhaps, or of guilt. Either way, someone in Mary Mead was now very desperate. And desperation, Miss Marple knew, was the truest sign that the noose of truth had begun to tighten. The note trembled slightly between Miss Marple's fingers as she read it again. Each line etched with the unmistakable urgency of someone trapped between guilt and dread. She folded it neatly and placed it on the small side table beside her chair, her mind already setting about the careful business of sorting possibilities. The tone of the note, pleading, remorseful, suggested not the cool calculation of a murderer, but the panic of an accomplice who had stumbled too far. Yet even accomplices, Miss Marple reflected, could be dangerous when cornered. By mid-morning, Inspector Slack was back in the village, gruffer than ever, and more impatient for answers. "We've questioned everyone who might have sent that note," he said briskly, standing by Miss Marple's gate. "Half the village admits to being up half the night gossiping, but not one soul will own to posting it." Miss Marple regarded him mildly. "People rarely admit to what frightens them, Inspector, and fear is the strongest motivator of silence. He gave her a sharp look. You think the note's genuine, then? Not some villager playing tricks? Oh, quite genuine, she replied softly. The handwriting trembles at the end of each stroke. It's written by someone accustomed to steady script, a clerk or secretary, perhaps, but under distress. And I dare say the writer feared discovery as much as punishment. Slack grunted, though she saw the flicker of interest in his eyes. So, what do you make of it, Miss Marple? I think, she said gently, that someone who handled other people's secrets has now been caught in the middle of one too large to contain. That afternoon, she took a quiet walk toward Mill Lane, the place mentioned in the note found near Mr. Pierce's body. The hedgerows grew thick there, and the lane sloped toward the river, where the willows leaned heavily over the water. There, caught in the reeds, she noticed something glinting faintly in the pale sunlight. Stooping delicately, she drew it out with the edge of her handkerchief. A small metal tag, engraved with a number and the faint initials C.G. Her brows lifted slightly. Colonel Graves. She tucked it safely away and continued walking, her mind turning over the growing tangle. A letter confessing the colonel's misdeed. A solicitor dead. A maid vanished. A postmaster poisoned. And now this a link, perhaps literal, to the very man whose reputation the letter threatened. When she returned to her cottage, she found Mrs. Clement waiting anxiously on her doorstep. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't know where else to go," she burst out. "The inspector thinks Leonard's hiding something. He asked to see the church accounts, says there's a discrepancy." Miss Marple ushered her inside gently. "Come, my dear, sit down. Now tell me everything." Mrs. Clement wrung her hands. "It's absurd, of course. Leonard only borrowed a small sum from the repair fund last month to pay the bell ringer's wages, and it was all replaced. But Inspector Slack thinks it has something to do with Mr. Halliday's letter. He believes my husband knew about Colonel Graves's false accounts and helped conceal them for the sake of the parish." Miss Marple's expression softened. "I'm quite certain your husband's conscience is clear, but I do think someone in this village is trying to shift suspicion, perhaps onto the safest shoulders available." "Then, who would do such a thing?" "The same person," Miss Marple murmured, "who understood that a vicar's integrity would draw attention away from themselves." That evening, as dusk fell, she took the small metal tag from her pocket and compared it with the broken key under her lamp. The fit was imperfect, yet the metal was the same. Both, she was certain now, had come from the same set, the colonel's safe, the one supposedly emptied years ago when his affairs were settled. But what if that safe had not been emptied? What if another confession, something even more damning, had been hidden away all this time? And what if someone in Mary Mead had known? A soft knock broke her thoughts. She opened the door to find old Henry Wills again, hat in hand, his face drawn. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but I thought you ought to see this. Found it near the river while trimming the hedge." He held out a torn corner of paper, water-stained but legible. It bore 2 words in the same handwriting as the earlier note: Graves's lockbox. Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Where exactly did you find this?" "Right near the willow bend, ma'am. Same place they say the girl was seen last." She thanked him, closing the door softly after he left. Her eyes lingered on the firelight flickering across the paper. The pattern was no longer scattered now, it was aligning, piece by piece. Somewhere near the river lay the final link, and she could almost hear the echo of Miss Marple's own quiet certainty. The village itself was whispering the truth. One simply had to listen closely enough. The next morning broke grey and heavy, the air dense with the kind of silence that seemed to press against the windows of Mary Mead. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual, her thoughts already circling the discoveries of the previous day. Broken key, the metal tag, and now the fragment mentioning Graves's lockbox, each clue fitting neatly, almost too neatly, into a pattern that was beginning to form in her mind. Yet something still resisted. Truth, she often reminded herself, was rarely tidy. It preferred to hide in the folds of ordinary life, beneath human frailty and fear. After breakfast, she walked toward the church, her eyes taking in every small detail of the village, the milk bottles left at gates, the faint wisp of smoke from chimneys, the nervous way Mrs. Price Ridley drew her curtains aside as Miss Marple passed. The gossip, she knew, had now ripened into speculation. Some whispered that the vicar had destroyed the letter to protect his parish. Others insisted Edie had stolen it for money. Few mentioned Mr. Pierce anymore, his death already woven into the fabric of rumor, softened by distance. Such was village life. Tragedy in the morning, replaced by triviality by tea time. Inside the church, the air was cool and still. Reverend Clement stood by the altar rail, sorting hymn sheets with a weary expression. He looked up as she approached. "Miss Marple, I don't know how to thank you for standing by us through this dreadful business." "My dear Reverend," she said gently. "Truth seldom arrives with trumpets. It tiptoes in softly, and most people are too busy talking to notice. Tell me, have you ever come across the phrase, 'Graves's lockbox'?" He frowned, shaking his head. "No, I can't say I have. Though, come to think of it, Colonel Graves once kept a small strongbox in his study. He used it for private papers, his will, military records, that sort of thing. When he passed, the executors collected his effects. At least, that's what I was told. Do you know who those executors were? Mr. Halliday, of course, and Martin Graves, his nephew." Miss Marple nodded slowly. So the very man who would lose the most from the colonel's confession was also one of the few who had access to his private papers. Before the vicar could answer, the church door creaked open and Inspector Slack entered, his coat dusted with rain. "Miss Marple," he said grimly, "you've done it again. We've just received word Edie's been found." Mrs. Clement, who had been arranging flowers near the pulpit, gasped. "Found? Oh, thank heaven. Is she alive?" Slack hesitated. "Barely. The poor girl was discovered near the riverbank, weak, half drowned, but alive enough to mutter a few words before fainting again. She's been taken to the infirmary at Much Benham. Said something about a box, and about being followed." Miss Marple's face softened, though her eyes sharpened with purpose. "Then I must see her," she said quietly. "At once." An hour later, she stood beside the narrow bed where Edie lay, pale as linen, her hands trembling against the sheets. The girl's eyes fluttered open at the sound of Miss Marple's voice. "It's all right, my dear," she murmured soothingly. "No one will harm you now, but you must tell me. What did you find?" Edie's lips moved faintly. "The vicar's safe," she whispered. "I didn't take it. I only looked, saw the letter, the name." Her breath hitched, and she swallowed hard. "Then, someone came in. Said it was his by right. He took it and told me to forget. But I couldn't. I followed him to the river. He threw something in a box, silver latch. Then he saw me." Her voice broke into a quiet sob. "I ran. He came after me." Miss Marple touched her hand gently. "Do you remember his face?" Edie's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Martin," she breathed. "Mr. Martin Graves." By the time Miss Marple left the infirmary, rain had begun to fall in a soft, relentless drizzle. She walked slowly through the village, her mind tracing the final curve of the pattern now made clear. Martin Graves, desperate, to conceal his uncle's confession, had stolen the letter, killed Halliday to erase the trail, silenced Mr. Pierce, who might have known of the theft, and pursued poor Edie when she became the one loose thread left untied. But what of the lockbox? Why destroy one document and yet throw another away? That question lingered as she reached her cottage. On the doorstep, she paused, turning her face toward the mist. Somewhere beyond the churchyard, the river glimmered faintly, its surface rippling in the rain. If the truth lay anywhere now, it lay beneath that water, waiting, patient, unspoiled by lies. Miss Marple set her jaw, her voice no louder than the rain itself. "Then tomorrow, she whispered. "We shall see what the river has to tell." The rain continued through the night, a steady whisper against the windows of Mary Mead that seemed to echo the quiet unrest settling over the village. By morning, the sky had cleared, though the ground was still soft and glistening. Miss Marple, wrapped in her blue shawl, stepped out early, her purpose already firm. She had arranged to meet Inspector Slack by the riverbank, near the place where Edie claimed Martin Graves had thrown the lockbox into the water. The inspector arrived precisely on time, his boots thick with mud and his mood none too pleasant. "I don't suppose you fancy a bit of wading, Miss Marple," he grumbled, eyeing the sluggish current. "We've brought a constable with a dragline. If there's anything down there, we'll find it soon enough." Miss Marple only smiled faintly. "Water, Inspector, has a way of keeping secrets, though not forever. It tends to return what man would rather bury." It took nearly an hour before the constable's line snagged on something heavy. With careful effort, they hauled it up, dripping and brown with silt, a small metal box, its latch rusted but still intact. Slack knelt beside it, prying it open with his penknife. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were several papers, damp but legible. He unfolded the first and gave a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. It's another confession signed by Colonel Graves himself. Not just about false accounts this time. He admits to blackmailing a fellow officer, years back, during the war." Miss Marple took a slow breath. So the colonel's guilt was greater than anyone knew. And his nephew, knowing that, destroyed one confession to protect the family name, never realizing another still existed. Slack looked grim. "That explains the motive clear enough. Martin Graves inherits everything if his uncle's reputation remains clean. If not scandal, bankruptcy, disgrace. So he steals the letter from the vicar's safe, kills Halliday to keep him quiet, poisons Pierce for fear he'd seen the telegram, and chases the maid who might have known too much." "Fear," Miss Marple said softly, "is a most persuasive reason to commit wickedness. But guilt, Inspector, has its own habits. It drives a man not only to hide what he's done, but to watch, constantly, in terror of being found out. Such a man will reveal himself if one only gives him time." Slack eyed her suspiciously. "And what do you propose?" "A simple thing," she said, smiling gently. "We invite Mr. Graves to tea." That afternoon, as the clock in the vicarage struck 4, Martin Graves arrived impeccably dressed, though his face betrayed sleeplessness. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting basket on her lap, appearing perfectly at ease. Inspector Slack stood unobtrusively by the window, pretending to study the rain streaking down the glass. "I understand," Miss Marple began kindly, "that you must be quite distressed by all this unpleasantness, Mr. Graves. The village has been in such turmoil, poor Mr. Pierce, the burglary, that dreadful business at the river. It must have been difficult for you, especially so soon after your uncle's passing." He gave a stiff nod. "It's been quite trying, yes. I came today, in fact, to offer any assistance I might give." "How thoughtful of you," she said mildly. "And yet, I wonder, Mr. Graves, did you truly come to assist, or to see what we had found?" His eyes flickered. "Found? The lockbox," she said gently. "It was recovered this morning. Your uncle's confession was inside." For a moment, the room seemed to shrink around him. His hand twitched at his side. His breath caught. "That's impossible," he stammered. There couldn't have been." Miss Marple's voice remained soft, almost apologetic. "You see, it's rather difficult to throw away the truth, Mr. Graves. It has a way of floating back to the surface, much like the lockbox." He rose abruptly, eyes darting toward the door, but Slack was already there, stepping forward with quiet finality. "That'll do, Mr. Graves. I think we've heard enough." The man's composure cracked. Then, "You don't understand," he said hoarsely. "It wasn't meant to go so far. Halliday threatened to expose everything. Pierce found the telegram. He would have ruined me. And the girl, she followed me. I only meant to frighten her. Slack's expression hardened. You did more than that. Miss Marple looked at him with a faint, sorrowful kindness. You see, Mr. Graves, evil seldom begins as evil. It begins as fear or pride or the desire to protect what one loves. But it ends, always, in destruction. He said nothing more. When the constable led him away, the rain had stopped, and the last of the light glowed faintly through the clouds. Miss Marple stood by the hearth, her knitting untouched. The rhythm of the village would soon resume, gossip turning to sympathy, whispers to quiet remembrance. Yet beneath it all, she knew, the echo of this tragedy would linger, a reminder that even in the calmest of places, darkness could bloom unseen. As she poured the last of the tea, she murmured softly to herself, "Human nature never changes, only the circumstances do." Then, with her usual grace, she resumed her knitting, the soft clicking of needles marking the close of another mystery untangled. The morning after Martin Graves's arrest, Mary Mead awoke to a quiet that felt almost reverent. The villagers moved about their daily tasks with an odd restraint, as if reluctant to disturb the fragile peace settling over the place. Yet peace in Mary Mead was never a simple matter. Beneath the calm of teacups and greetings at the grocer's, there lingered the uneasy hum of curiosity, the kind that thrived on half-truths and suppositions. People spoke in whispers again, lowering their voices as Miss Marple passed by, wondering how she could have known what the police had missed. Miss Marple, for her part, moved through the day with the same serene composure as ever. She neither sought attention nor shunned it. After so many years in the population village, she knew well how gossip worked, how swiftly it turned heroes into meddlers and villains into victims. She spent her morning tending her roses and mending a tear in one of her lace tablecloths, her mind only half on her work. For though Martin Graves had confessed to his crimes, something in the matter still troubled her. She could not yet name it. But it sat in her thoughts, like a shadow at the edge of lamplight, something that did not fit neatly into the pattern. Her instinct, that delicate compass honed by years of watching human behavior, told her that the story was not quite finished. There was still a thread dangling loose, and if there was one thing Miss Marple could not bear, it was a loose thread in the tapestry of truth. In the afternoon, Inspector Slack called again, his manner brisk but oddly subdued. "I thought you'd like to know, Miss Marple," he said, accepting a cup of tea. "Graves has signed a full statement. He admits to stealing the letter, killing Halliday, and poisoning Pierce. Says he acted alone." Miss Marple nodded slowly, stirring her tea though she'd already added sugar. "And yet, Inspector, you don't quite believe that?" Slack hesitated. "Well, between you and me, I'm not sure I do. The fellow's clever, I'll grant him that, but he's not the sort to plan 3 murders and carry them off cleanly. Halliday's death, yes, that I can believe. But Pierce? That took cunning. And the poison cyanide, of all things, that's not something one just stumbles upon." "Precisely," Miss Marple said softly. "Fear makes men desperate, but not methodical. Someone else, I think, provided the means, perhaps even the suggestion." Slack frowned. "An accomplice? But who?" "I can't yet say," she murmured, "though I suspect the answer lies closer than you think." That night, long after the inspector had gone, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her mind quietly turning over the puzzle. The broken key, the lockbox, the confessions, all of it revolved around Colonel Graves. But what if the real secret lay not in the Colonel's sins, but in who stood to gain from exposing or concealing them? She remembered Helen Halliday, the Colonel's niece by marriage, a quiet, refined woman who had remained remarkably composed throughout the ordeal. Too composed, Miss Marple thought, and it was Helen, not Martin, who had first urged that the letter be kept secret, claiming it was a matter of family dignity. The following morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to Much Benham, where Helen Halliday now lived in the late solicitor's house. The maid who answered the door looked nervous, as though instructed to deny entry. But Helen herself appeared before Miss Marple could be turned away. She was pale, elegantly dressed, her expression composed but wary. "My dear Miss Marple," she said, smiling faintly. "This is quite unexpected. I suppose you've come about that dreadful business. I do hope the village is settling down again." Miss Marple returned the smile. "Villages always settle, my dear, but the truth rarely rests so easily." She studied Helen quietly, noting the faint tremor in her hand as she gestured toward the drawing room. Helen hesitated, then said with a trace of irritation, "If you've come to speak of Martin, I assure you, I know nothing more. His actions have been unspeakable." "Oh, I'm sure they were," Miss Marple said mildly. "Yet I couldn't help thinking, as I read the reports, that his actions were remarkably convenient for someone else. After all, with both Mr. Halliday and Mr. Pierce gone, there's no one left who might have questioned certain details of your uncle's estate." Helen's eyes flashed, then quickly softened. "Really, Miss Marple, that's absurd." "Is it?" Miss Marple said gently. "You were the one who insisted the vicar keep that envelope sealed. You visited much. Benham the very night before Mr. Halliday died, though you told the police you hadn't been in town for days, and I found it curious that a lady so refined should know the scent of bitter almonds." Helen froze. Her teacup clinked faintly as she set it down. "You have no proof of that." Miss Marple's voice remained calm, almost kind. "Oh, I think I do. The maid who served you at the solicitor's office recalled your perfume an unusual one, almond and jasmine. She mentioned it to Inspector Slack without realizing its significance." The silence stretched. Then Helen's poise cracked, and her voice trembled. "It wasn't meant to happen that way. Martin was a fool," he panicked. "Halliday was threatening to ruin us both. I only wanted the letter destroyed, for the family's sake. I never meant for anyone to die." Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her tone carried quiet finality. "It is always the same, my dear. One lie to preserve respectability, one small deceit to protect pride, and before you know it, the line between shielding and sinning disappears entirely." There was a sound from the doorway. Inspector Slack stepped inside, his expression grave. "That'll do, Mrs. Halliday. I think we've heard enough." Helen turned away, shoulders shaking silently. The room felt suddenly cold, though the fire still burned bright. Later, as they drove back to Mary Mead, Slack shook his head. "You never cease to astonish me, Miss Marple. I'd have sworn the case was closed." She smiled faintly. "Crimes of passion are often untidy, Inspector, but crimes of conscience, they leave a very neat pattern if you know how to look." The car turned into the lane, the village coming into view again, the vicarage chimney smoking, the post office door newly painted, the faint sound of the church bell marking the hour. Miss Marple looked out across the familiar rooftops and sighed softly. "It will all fade soon enough," she said, half to herself. "Tea will be poured, gossip will return, and the good people of Mary Mead will forget. But somewhere, deep down, a reminder will linger that even in a peaceful village, truth is the hardest thing to bury." She smiled then, gently and without triumph, as the car rolled past her gate. Inside her cottage, the roses waited, the kettle stood ready, and her knitting basket lay open beside her chair, life, simple and unassuming, resuming its quiet rhythm once more. The following days passed quietly, as though the village itself were trying to forget the dark shadow that had so recently fallen upon it. Mary Mead returned to its usual rhythm, the chime of the church clock marking the hours, the gossip at the grocer's turning from tragedy to triviality. The talk of murders and confessions faded into murmurs, then into silence, and before long, the village carried on as though the river had never yielded up its grim secret. Yet Miss Marple, though outwardly serene, sensed that not all was settled. She had long ago learned that human wickedness was seldom as tidy as a signed confession. True guilt had a habit of clinging to life in unexpected ways. Inspector Slack, who prided himself on finality, paid her a visit one afternoon to declare the case officially closed. "Both Graves and Mrs. Halliday have confessed," he said, standing stiffly by her parlor window. "There'll be a hearing next week, though I expect she'll claim diminished responsibility. Between us, I doubt she'll hang. Too refined for it, they'll say. The jury always pities a lady." Miss Marple poured him tea, her expression unreadable. "Refinement," she said softly, "is rather like respectability. It's easy to polish on the surface, but it cracks quickly under strain." Slack chuckled uneasily. "You've got a sharp tongue for such a gentle lady, Miss Marple. Still, I'll say this without your help. We might never have pieced it all together. The commissioner himself said you've got the instincts of a bloodhound." Miss Marple smiled modestly. "Oh, I wouldn't say that, Inspector. I simply observe. People are infinitely revealing if one takes the trouble to notice the small things they don't mean to show." When he left, she remained seated for some time, the uneaten biscuit on her plate growing soft in the steam from her teacup. Her eyes rested absently on the garden beyond her window, the ivy creeping along the fence, the sparrows darting through the hedge. Everything appeared tranquil again, yet the unease in her heart refused to fade. It wasn't guilt, nor doubt in her own deductions. It was something quieter, subtler, like the faint wrong note in a well-tuned instrument. She rose at last, wrapping her shawl about her shoulders, and stepped into the garden. A faint chill lingered in the air despite the sunlight, and she found herself drawn toward the lane that led to the vicarage. Mrs. Clement greeted her at the door, pale but smiling, and ushered her into the sitting room where the vicar sat reading. "My dear Miss Marple," he said warmly, closing his book, "we were just speaking of you. The whole parish owes you a debt for restoring peace to our little corner of the world." "Oh, I hardly think I've done that," she said gently. "Peace, Mr. Clement, is a rather delicate thing. It tends to rest uneasily when too many truths are left half-buried." The vicar looked puzzled. "But surely, everything's been resolved?" She hesitated before answering. "Perhaps. But I keep thinking of that lockbox, how carefully it was wrapped, how deliberately it was thrown into the river. It was not done in haste, and I cannot help wondering whose hands prepared it." Mrs. Clement frowned. "Surely Martin's." "Martin was impulsive," Miss Marple said softly. "Desperate, yes, but not methodical. The wrapping the oilcloth, the way it was sealed, it was done with precision. The kind of detail one might expect from someone used to keeping records, not destroying them." The vicar's expression grew troubled. "Then you believe someone else." "I believe," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that the river still holds one truth we have not yet drawn from it." That evening, unable to dismiss the thought, she took a lantern and walked toward the river alone. The light had faded to a dusky blue, and the air was damp with mist. The water moved sluggishly, whispering over stones, carrying with it the faint scent of moss and decay. She stood where the constables had dredged up the lockbox, her gaze sweeping the reeds and the muddy bank. Something glittered faintly near a fallen branch. She bent to examine it, a small brooch, shaped like a dove with a tiny sapphire at its eye. She knew it at once. It belonged to Mrs. Clement. For a long moment, she stood motionless, the brooch cold in her palm. Then, quietly, she turned back toward the vicarage. Her knock was soft but insistent, and when Mrs. Clement appeared, she seemed startled to see her. "Oh, Miss Marple, how very odd you've been out walking." "Yes," Miss Marple said, holding out the brooch. "And I believe I found something of yours near the river." Mrs. Clement's hand flew to her collar, her face draining of color. "Oh, why, yes. I must have dropped it that dreadful day when we all went to search. How careless of me." Miss Marple studied her in silence for a long moment. "You were there before the search party arrived, weren't you?" The woman's lips parted, but no sound came. The vicar, hearing their voices, appeared in the doorway. concern furrowing his brow. "My dear, what's this?" Mrs. Clement's composure crumbled. I only meant to protect you, Leonard," she whispered, her voice breaking. "When I found the letter gone, I feared it would ruin you after all the gossip about the funds, so I went to Halliday. I begged him to keep quiet, but Helen had already been there. She'd told him everything. He laughed, said we were all tainted. I only wanted to take the letter back, to destroy it, to keep your name safe." Miss Marple's voice was almost tender. "And when you saw the box in the Colonel's papers, you threw it into the river yourself, didn't you? Not to hide a crime, but to bury shame." Mrs. Clement sank into the nearest chair, weeping silently. The vicar stood motionless beside her, the depth of his sorrow unreadable. When Miss Marple left them, the church bell was tolling softly across the fields. She walked home slowly, her lantern swinging, her expression thoughtful but serene. Human hearts, she mused, were rarely wicked through and through. More often, they were simply frightened of judgment, of scandal, of losing the fragile dignity that life demanded they maintain. Later, as she sat by her fire, she wrote a small note to Inspector Slack. It contained only a few lines. No further arrests should be made. The last act of concealment was not criminal, only human. She folded it neatly and sealed it. Outside, the mist thickened, and the village sank once more into quiet. Tomorrow would bring sunlight again, and gossip would flutter anew. But for now, in the heart of Mary Mead, the secrets of the river and the sorrows of the living rested together in peace. Miss Marple laid her knitting across her lap and smiled faintly, the firelight catching the gentle gleam of her spectacles. The world, in its curious way, was once again perfectly ordinary. The fire in Miss Marple's hearth had burned down to a red glow when the clock on her mantel softly struck 10. She sat motionless in her chair, hands folded over her knitting, though the needles were still. The village outside was steeped in quiet, the sort of deep stillness that seemed to belong only to small English villages after scandal has finally exhausted itself. Yet her thoughts did not rest. The confession of Mrs. Clement had brought a curious peace to some hearts and quieted suspicion among others, but for Miss Marple, the ending felt like a curtain hastily drawn over a stage where the final actor had not yet bowed. There was something incomplete still lingering behind the neatness of events, something too perfectly resolved to be true. She rose, poured herself another small cup of tea, and went to her desk, where the letter she had written to Inspector Slack lay, folded and sealed. She had written it out of pity for Mrs. Clement and the vicar, urging the inspector not to pursue the matter further. The poor woman's act, she had written, was not wickedness but devotion misplaced. Yet, even as she had signed it, something within her had resisted an instinct sharpened through years of observing the frailty and cunning of human hearts. The tone of Mrs. Clement's confession had been too complete, too rehearsed, as though she had carried not only guilt but a script. The next morning broke with a pale sun and the thin sound of the church bell calling to early service. Miss Marple attended as she always did, her delicate frame sitting upright in the second pew from the front. Mrs. Clement was absent, though the vicar conducted the service with quiet composure. His voice, though steady, carried a weariness that told its own story. When the hymn ended, Miss Marple's eyes wandered to the back of the church, where Edie, pale but recovered, had taken her old place among the parishioners. The girl's eyes met hers briefly, a flicker of recognition and unease passing between them. After the service, Miss Marple waited until the vicar had gone to his vestry and the others had filed out. Edie lingered by the door, clutching her shawl tightly about her. "You're looking stronger, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "A little pale, perhaps, but time and honesty have a way of restoring one's color." Girl gave a quick nod. "Yes, ma'am. I've been trying not to think of it, but every night I still hear the river." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "The river doesn't keep secrets for long, Edie. It simply waits for people to stop watching before it gives them back." Edie hesitated, her lips trembling. "Miss Marple." she whispered suddenly. "Mrs. Clement, she wasn't the one who threw that box in. I saw her there that night, yes, but she wasn't alone. There was someone else. I didn't tell the inspector, I was too afraid." Miss Marple felt a chill run down her spine. "Someone else? Who?" "My dear, I couldn't see properly. It was dark, and they stood by the willows. But I heard a man's voice, low, angry. He said something like, 'You fool, now we'll both be ruined.' Then she cried, 'No, I won't let it go that far.' After that, there was a splash and I ran." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on the girl's arm. "You've done quite right to tell me, Edie. Not another word to anyone for now." When she returned home, she found herself pacing the parlor in deep thought. A man's voice, the timing, the tone, the urgency. It could not have been Martin Graves. He had already fled the village by then. And the vicar, surely, could not. Or could he? Her mind returned to his drawn face, the exhaustion beneath his calm manner, his absence from the house at curious hours. Devotion and guilt had often been uneasy companions in her long experience. By afternoon, Miss Marple's decision was made. She took her umbrella and walked once again to the vicarage. Mrs. Clement greeted her with a nervous smile that did little to conceal her unease. "Oh, Miss Marple, how kind of you to call. Leonard is resting. He's not been himself since everything happened." "I'm so sorry to hear that," Miss Marple replied softly, taking a seat by the fire. "And yet, it's quite understandable. These things weigh heavily on a man's conscience, especially when that man has done nothing wrong." Mrs. Clement's fingers tightened on her handkerchief. "You mean Leonard's reputation, of course. It's dreadful, the way people talk." Miss Marple studied her quietly. "Yes, reputation is a fragile thing, isn't it? I often think it drives people to far greater follies than greed ever could. For instance, to conceal the mistakes of someone they love, or to share in them." Mrs. Clement's face went white. "What do you mean by that?" Before Miss Marple could answer, the vicar entered, pale and tense, his cassock still damp from the morning rain. His eyes flickered from his wife to Miss Marple. "I thought I heard voices," he said evenly. "Is something the matter?" "Not at all," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I was merely admiring how strong Mrs. Clement has been through all this. It can't have been easy, especially that night by the river." The silence that followed was heavy and immediate. Mrs. Clement's hand fluttered to her throat. The vicar's expression froze, then softened into something weary and almost defeated. "I told you, Mary," he said quietly. "It would come to this." She turned to him with wide eyes. "Leonard, no, please." But he held up a hand, and for the first time Miss Marple saw not the mild clergyman, but the man beneath the one who had carried too much for too long. "It was I who took the box, Miss Marple," he said at last. "I knew of its contents. Halliday had shown me a copy weeks before, and I begged him to keep silent for the sake of the parish. When I learned he was dead, I thought the matter buried. But when the theft at my own safe occurred, I knew the truth would come out, and that it would destroy her." His eyes rested gently on his wife. "Mary found me there by the river. She tried to stop me, but it was too late." Mrs. Clement's voice broke. "I wanted to tell them it was me to protect him. I thought if I confessed, they'd let it end." Miss Marple sat very still, her face composed, but her heart heavy. "And so the sins of pride and pity become one," she said softly. "You wished to save each other, and in doing so nearly damned yourselves both." The vicar bowed his head. "We will tell the inspector. I can't live with the lie any longer." "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "You'll tell him nothing. The dead have been accounted for, and the living deserve their peace. The truth, Reverend, is often best left between one's soul and God." There was silence again, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock. Mrs. Clement wept softly, and the vicar pressed her hand to his lips in wordless gratitude. When Miss Marple stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet earth and lilac, and the faint glow of sunset lingered over the church spire. She walked slowly back to her cottage, her steps light but her mind reflective. The law, she thought, was a necessary thing, but it dealt in lines too rigid for the delicate shadings of conscience. Human nature was far messier, its motives seldom pure, its sins often tangled with love and fear. That evening, she wrote a single line in her journal before setting it aside. Justice has many faces. Sometimes mercy is the truest of them. Then she sat once more by her fire, her knitting resumed, the steady click of her needles echoing softly through the room. Outside, the church bell tolled 8, and Mary Mead lay peaceful beneath the gathering dusk. In the vicarage, 2 souls prayed for forgiveness, and by the river, the last ripples of truth finally stilled. Miss Marple lifted her eyes from her work and smiled faintly to herself. Another mystery had passed, leaving behind it not triumph, but understanding. And in her quiet heart, she knew that was enough.